The Jamaica Public Service company JPS says it's facing a major problem with customers offloading from the company's electrical grid. Chief Operations Officer Gary Barrow says this has far-reaching implications, including increased cost to JPS's operations. He shared the concern while addressing a recent Parliament Joint Select Committee reviewing the Electricity Act 2015.
Mr. Barrow says offloading takes two forms.
One is where the customers leave the grid entirely, so they are no longer grid tied. And the second is when they shift their load. That is, they partially leave the grid, and at times they will jump back on the grid through being grid tied.
He says large industrial and residential customers are the ones who tend to go off-grid, and they contribute to a large portion of JPS's revenue.
We have other areas that contribute to the distortion when speaking of grid defection. And the first is an inequity in the tax treatment across corporations, that in one instance provide incentive for certain corporations to leave the grid and puts JPS at a disadvantage.
He says the second issue is a lack of a cost-based structure, noting that the tariff must be based on the cost to serve the customer.
And if we consider the cost to serve the customer, this means that when a large customer leaves the grid, the remaining customers then stand the cost, primarily the fixed cost of the grid, which in simple terms, it means that when customers leave the grid, the remaining customers, who are typically the ones less able to afford to leave the grid, then has to bear the burden of the cost of the grid. And so that is something I think is very important that we bear in mind. And typically what we have seen in other markets is that this leads to something typically referred to as the death spiral, where as more customers leave the grid, the cost of the remaining customers become more expensive, and then those customers are then further incentivized to leave the grid, and it continues through what we call a death spiral.
Mr. Barrow explains that this will affect the viability of the grid.
We highly recommend preserving the integrity of the current definition of self-generation, as we have seen some recommendations that would disrupt that and encourage further grid defection. And so, in summary, we strongly encourage the legislators to evaluate the proposed changes and determine whether the criteria that is being used is in the collective interest of all the customers served on the grid and ultimately in the best interest of Jamaica.
He says while the JPS respects the right of a customer to leave the grid, they are urging all stakeholders to consider the implications.